For a hand is upon the throne of God. God will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So this is not just a local war. Seems like something that's going to go on the Dol Vadol. But in Devarim, which is the maftir for Shabbat Zachor, that small section of 3 verses, it's a little different. And who will volunteer to read the verse in Devarim?
Okay. Therefore, when your God grants you safety from all your enemies around you, in the land that your God is giving you as a hereditary portion, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget.
How is that different from the previous story, from this one?
We thought that God was going to do it, right?
Ah, excellent. So what happened? We thought God promised that he will have the war. Now suddenly it's the people have to have this everlasting war and blot their memory from under the heaven.
But
Suddenly
blotting the memory and having a war are 2 different things.
right. But the word blot is the same. You're right. It's not, I will blot this. I'm talking about this blot. You're right. Here there's a war. Here there's a war, but I'm talking about the words blot.
Right.
Blot out the memory. Here, God is going to blot out the memory. Now, suddenly in Devarim, it's you, timche. It's a command form, or a second person talking to the Israelites. You shall blot out the memory of Amalek. And so that's how he became the arch rival, the enemy par excellence. And the question I want to raise is it really justified? So yeah, there was a war, and we see the picture of the war, but why? Well, why is he singled out of all the enemies? So yes, there are 2 additional facts provided in that little passage in Devarim, what we call maftir Zachor, and that is 1, the Amalekites used cruel tactics by targeting the weak and the stragglers. Do you see the Hebrew in red? Vayizanev becha kol hanechshalim acharecha. You see it, right? So that's he attacked the nechshalim. That's the weak, the stragglers, the
failures, as we say.
Yeah, that's with a kaf, right? But it could be interchangeable. Kaf and ches. Today we say nichshal, failed in a test. Here it's more like weak and poor and unable and maybe disabled. Okay. And number 2, he was lo yareh Elohim. So maybe that's why we single him out. But here's the problem. If we go back to Genesis, we see, first of all, before we go back to Genesis, they had other negative encounters with other nations in the desert. Who else did they fight?
Right. What's the big deal here? What's unique about it?
Right. So who else did they fight in the desert?
Moab.
They were not allowed to fight Moabs, but they did fight the Midianites. There was a war with the Midianites. There was a war with the Amorites. And Balak tried to curse them. There was that whole big story. Who hired Bilam. And if we go back to Egypt, the Egyptians persecuted them and enslaved them for hundreds of years. Yet the Egyptians are protected. Look at this verse from that same chapter in Deuteronomy. You're not allowed to do anything to the Egyptians. Look at this verse. You shall not abhor an Egyptian. Did you know that? For you are a stranger in that land. You would think if anyone should become the arch enemy, it should be the Egyptians. There should be an everlasting war from generation to generation with the Egyptians.
But it was Pharaoh. It was Paro.
With Pharaoh. But yet, the Torah regarding the Egyptians says not only there's no war from generation to generation or blot them out, you're actually not allowed to leta'ev, to abhor an Egyptian, using the strange reasoning that we were strangers in that land. We were not strangers, we were enslaved. So again, why singling out Amalek? he seems to be just one of many enemies, and maybe not the worst. Okay, so now let's go back to Genesis. Yeah, so all the other Amalek seem to become God's eternal enemies. And the question is why? So now we go back to Bereshit. And in Bereshit, the first time the word Amalek appears is there was the four kings against the 5 kings. During Abraham's lifetime, what famously happened in that war that got Abraham involved?
Lot got captured.
His nephew Lot was
Right,
kidnapped.
now got captured. Otherwise, we wouldn't care so much that there were these 4 kings who fought against the 5 kings. Now, among those 5 kings, or actually the invading 4 kings attacked a territory inhabited by the Amalekites, as you see in this verse. You see it on their way back. They came to Ein Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and subdued all the territory of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who dwelled in Chatzatzon Tamar. So no, nothing special about it. Just one more people living in that area who got entangled in that war. But now let's talk about Amalek the person. Who is Amalek the person? That appears later in Bereshit. Timnah was a concubine of Esav's son Eliphaz, and she bore Amalek to Eliphaz. So what is the relationship between Amalek and Esav?
Grandfather.
Right, exactly. Esav is Amalek's grandfather. Now, this seems to be incongruous with having already previously a whole territory inhabited by Amalekites. How could that be? During Abraham's time, there was already Amalekites, yet the person Amalek, presumably from which the Amalekites came, only appears later in Bereshit, in Vayishlach, right? So this may have been added, may have been out of order. In any case, already here we're seeing that Amalek, being the son of a concubine, what does that tell us about his status?
Lower than
Not as good.
the
Oh,
son.
exactly.
Second class.
Oh, but before that, we'll see that in the next slide. In that same chapter, Amalek is just another clan. So you can see the verse here. These are the clans of the children of Esav, the descendants of Esav's firstborn Eliphaz, the clans of Teman, Omar, Tzfo, and Kenaz, Korach, Gatam, and Amalek. These are the clans of Eliphaz in the land of Edom. So he's not singled out, he's not special, he's just one of the clans of Esav's grandchildren. And as some of you mentioned, it signals lower status because he's a son of a concubine. But still, that's not sinister, that's just lower status, okay? So that's still cannot explain what we saw about the war that God has with the Amalekites forever, from generation to generation. Now we go to the Sefer Bamidbar. Amalek as viewed by the spies who were sent by Moses. So they went into the land of Canaan and they came back and they reported. And what did they report? Any volunteer to read this verse?
Okay, however, the people who inhabit the country are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw giants there. Amalekites dwell in the Negev region. Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites inhabit the hill country, and Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan.
So is there any special mention of the Amalekites?
Well, they're one of the people.
Yeah, just one of the people there. Even the spies don't see them in their reporting. And you would think if there's a stronger enemy than the others, a more dangerous enemy, you would think he would get special attention. That's their job, to do intelligence. Intelligence, you can't treat everybody equally. You have to tell the people who should you be more afraid of, who should you focus your resources, your military resources on. And it seems from this verse that there is no, they shouldn't devote any special military resources to the Amalekites. Is just one of the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Canaanites, etc.
Well,
Now-
they live in the Negev. They certainly don't have the best property in the land.
In the land, right. You'd think that the ones on the hills, in the Judean hills, they would have they would have the upper hand. Okay, then they get punished by God and they overreact. The people of Israel say, okay, let's go and invade and conquer the land right now. But, and Moses warns them. This is right after the spies story. Moses warns, no, you already got punished and you have to take your consequences. And you can't now wage war and go into the land. But they don't listen to Moses. And the Torah tells us they got punished by the Amalekites and the Canaanites. And the verse is as follows. And the Amalekites and the Canaanites who dwelt in that hill country came down and dealt them, the Israelites, a shattering blow at Hormah.
How did they get from the Negev to the hill country? We don't know, huh?
Right. So not clear how suddenly they're in the hill country. Or maybe that's only the Canaanites. Maybe,
Okay.
yeah, maybe the hill country is only referring to the Canaanites. Well, could be.
And the Canaanites were singled out as living at on the coastline toward the coast.
Yeah.
Jordan.
But it could have been a war of maneuver. I mean, it doesn't
They
mean.
gathered together on the hill. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, there was a war here which the Israelites lost because remember they're punished now by God. They have to wander in the desert 40 years. They can't outmaneuver God. They got punished and they think they can do it on their own. And Moses warns them. So this is what they deserve, right? This is they have now been punished. They can't now suddenly go into the land of Israel. So it's almost like God is almost sending these Amalekites and Canaanites to teach them a lesson that you can't violate God's commands. But again, they're part of a pair, the Amalekites and the Canaanites. It's not just the Amalekites. Then we have them again in the book of Bamidbar, when he doesn't get much attention because we always focus on how Balaam cursed the Israelites, or attempted to curse. I'm sorry, right? He attempted to curse and God turned it around into blessings. But at the end of that chapter, he also prophesies about other peoples. And he prophesies about the Amalek. And it says, he, Balaam, saw Amalek, and taking up his theme, he said, a leading nation is Amalek, but its fate is to perish forever. So a kind of a foreboding prophecy that it's a powerful nation, but it's no match for the Israelites later in their conquest of the land of Canaan. They're not gonna hold it against the Israelites. But then he moves on to the Kenites and he talks about them. So again, it's not a special curse or prophecy vis-a-vis Amalek. So now we go to the Nevi'im, the book of Judges. And again, there we see a similar phenomenon that they appear alongside other enemies. So in the Gideon story, the prophet Gideon, we read, after the Israelites had done their sowing, Midian, Amalek, and the Kedemites would come up and raid them. So is this anything special about Amalek?
No.
No, it seems like it's just one of the three who would come and raid the Israelites. And then the prophet Gideon, he rescued the Israelites. He goes to war and he rescues them. Now, with King Saul, now you'd think it's different because the Haftarah that we read is that whole drama with God telling him a command and he violates the command. But before we get to that, in chapter 14, actually, the story of King Saul and Amalek is not dramatic at all. Here's what it says. When Saul had taken, any volunteer to read?
All right. When Saul had taken the kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the Ammonites, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he routed them. He did valiantly and struck down the Amalekites and rescued Israel out of the hands of those who plundered them.
Okay, so yeah, the Amalekites do have their own verse here, but
Yeah, why?
right, but seen in a larger context,
It's no different than the other.
no different. He fought against all his enemies.
Mhm.
Moab, Ammonites, Edom, Philistines. So he routed all the enemies. But then in the next chapter, so this is chapter 14. Chapter 15 in Samuel 1. However, in chapter 15, thus said Hashem of multitudes, God of multitudes, I am exacting the penalty for what Amalek did to Israel, for the assault he made upon them on the road, on their way up from Egypt. Now go, attack Amalek, prescribe all that belongs to him, spare no one, but kill alike men and women, infants and sucklings, oxen and sheep, camels and asses. So first of all, I would refuse such a command. This is a terrible command. But as we're going to see, it might have been rewritten into the text. And then we have to ask why. Because if we go back to chapter 14, nothing special happened there. He routed them as he routed all his other enemies, right? Look again at this verse. Now suddenly, in the next chapter, there's a special command, and it has to be a total wipeout. You can't spare anybody, not even infants, sucklings, oxen, and sheep, and camels. And then what famously happened? This is what we read every year in the Haftorah. What famously? So first of all, this seems to be fit. This seems to fit that after it's time to turn the attention to the ancient enemy, because if you remember in the book of Devarim, the command was when God when God, where was it? No, when you will rest from all your enemies, then you will have to blot them out. Oh, you see it right here? Do you see the slide? Therefore, when God grants you safety from all your enemies, then it's time to blot out the memory of Amalek. So this seems to suggest a fulfilling of that prophecy or that instruction, that now that Saul, he dealt all his enemies, routed them, he struck them down. So now it's time to turn the attention to the ancient enemy, the Amalekites. So what does he do? It's chapter 15. He gathers a tremendous army. He advances to the city of Amalek and waits in the wadi. He warns the Kenites, the allies, who are the allies of the Israelites, to leave the area. He doesn't want them to be caught up in the attack. And he deals them a crushing blow. But what happens next? Why is there a lot of drama in that story?
He doesn't
He
kill all of
didn't
them.
kill all the people.
Oh, right. He spares the king and the sheep. And so now God is furious with Saul, and through Samuel, the prophet, he comes to him and he says, God is going to tear the kingdom from you because you kept Agag the king alive and you did not slaughter all the animals. And even though Saul tries to repent, he tries a few excuses, it doesn't appease Samuel. And then Samuel says, no, the kingdom will be torn from you and given to another. And then Shmuel executes Agag himself. And so that's the end of the story of Amalek with Saul. But then Amalek reappears, amazingly, a few chapters later with David. And in the book of Shmuel, we read how David is now raiding the Amalekites. And I volunteer to read this verse.
Okay. David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Gizrites, and the Amalekites, who had been the inhabitants of the region forever, all the way to Shur and the land of Egypt. When David attacked the region, he would leave no man or woman alive. He would take flocks, herds, asses, camels, and clothing.
So seems there's no problem to take the animals alive, right? Even though we're dealing with the Amalekites. Here it doesn't seem that there is any problem with that because David is doing it.
God gave a specific task to King Saul, who didn't follow this specific.
Oh,
task.
so exactly. So the question is, why was that command there, and how did it suddenly enter the book of Samuel? So the way it's presented is that Amalek is not a special enemy of David or of God. And then what happened, according to one theory, is that the account of Saul's defeat was revised to include an introduction that God specifically instructed to prescribe all the animals. Why? So there's now a contest about the legacy between the David school and the Saul school. These are two competing narratives, not just narratives, two competing dynasties. And each one wants to take credit. Each one of these two dynasties. So now Saul, he actually defeated the Amalekites. We saw that in chapter 14. But the David school of scribes, they want to show that it's really David who should be given credit, and Saul actually messed up. So the theory is that they revised the story to include this very weird, because we don't find it anywhere else, that you have to kill all the animals, that you have to kill the king. And they added that to undermine Saul's whole story with Amalek and say, look, he actually violated God. You think he rescued the Israelites? No, but maybe he rescued them, but he violated God's command. And that justifies taking away the kingdom from him and giving it to David.
So I'm troubled from a historical point of view.
Yeah.
So apparently there were enough Amalekites to create a problem for David. They were left over because Saul didn't eliminate all the men. Why would David attack a supposedly helpless group, the Amalekites? If they were totally destroyed by Saul, why would David have to attack them?
Well, this was before
That's a good question, but I want to look at it from a different angle. What big victory is it if he just attacked the leftovers from Saul? It's no big victory. If we're going to say that Saul was an actual one who killed most of them and had this great victory, but then there were some leftovers, right? And then David came, and it's a very minor victory if it's told right after Saul's victory, because obviously the first war is the bigger war, and then the leftovers, those who somehow fled. Okay, so now David comes and he kills them, so that's not a big victory. So that explains, I think, why there needs to be a reworking of the story. We need to undermine Saul's legacy, and because otherwise David will not be credited with a lot.
Well,
David he
go ahead,
wasn't
Jen.
king at this time, though. He was like an outlaw, so to speak, an outlaw in the way from Saul, and he had his band of followers that after he had been anointed, he had people that followed him, and they had no way of eating or getting food. They even went to people in the land of Israel and took food from them. So he was kind of, he had to feed his group of followers. He wasn't king then. He had been anointed, but Saul was king. Am I not correct?
Yes, but the writing of Shmuel was done probably by pro-Davidic scribes. So they want to undermine Saul and give as much credit as possible to David. And
But
if-
you
if-
know what, Shammai,
Yeah.
there's another way of looking at it, not just giving credit to David, but condoning a lot of his behavior, which we, by our lights would consider very violent behavior. I mean, he wrote wonderful Psalms and he consolidated the kingdom, but he was also even in the books of the prophets, a very aggressive warrior, and that's an understatement. So this can by saying that Saul held back and didn't listen to God, it's basically saying David is listening to God and condoning his behavior.
Very interesting. I like that. I like that explanation very much. Yes. So it lifts up his actions. It almost justifies his actions when contrasted with Saul.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in summary, we have two different dynasties. They are competing in the in the minds of the Israelites, or in the narratives, as the founders of the monarchy. And you have one story competing, overshadowing the other story. And so what happened was the pro-Davidic scribes who wrote most of Samuel, they sort of, you could say, won. I should put the quotation marks in the won, the narrative consists by turning what was a military success of Saul on its head into a abject failure, because he violated God's command. He didn't do as he was told. The prophet has to come to him, tear away the kingdom, humiliate him in front of everyone. Remember that whole drama there with leaving the king and the sheep alive? It was in front of everyone. Everyone was watching it. The king violated God's command. Now the prophet has to do this bloody thing of executing the Agag, and right. So it's total humiliation for Saul, and probably written by the pro-Davidic scribes. So,
But it was the job of the prophets to humiliate the people.
the
that
kings,
they-
right.
That
So
was their job, because David had his prophet too, who
Nathan.
Nathan,
told
right.
him
Oh, very good point. Very good point. It's always they're checking their power, right? The prophets always checks and balances. So that could also be part of that. So to summarize, historically, as we saw, really Amalek was not significant. He was just another one of the enemies. But perhaps the reason why in our consciousness today we devote a lot of shul time to him in Haftorah and in Maftir is because of this whole competing narrative between the pro-Davidic school and the pro-Saul school, and that's perhaps why it changed it in our minds.
That's
And that's where the
fascinating.
phrase "history is written by the
Yeah,
victors"
the
comes.
winners.
Yes.
But you know what, Shammai, to